Hi there, I'm Mia. I've come back to tell you the next part of an old story. A story you might have heard last night, while lying still beneath the soft yellow glow of your bedside lamp. Or when the rain tapping against the window made your heart feel a little tender. Do you remember? Some letters are never sent, not because the writer forgot, but because sometimes just writing them down is enough. Tonight, it's raining again. The drops tap gently on the rooftop, like someone softly knocking on my heart. I sit alone again, opening my grandmother's old journal, its leather cover now softened by time. Today's page is a little wrinkled, and there's a small folded crease, as if she had hesitated for a long time before writing. The room is so quiet now. I can hear the ticking of the clock. The tea in my cup has cooled a little, but the scent of ginger still lingers. The desk lamp shines down on the page, like a gentle hand cradling memory. My grandmother, Lily, used to bake in a tiny shop at the end of the red brick street, where winters stretched long and summers passed by like the faintest brush of a hand. Every afternoon, she'd sit by the window, holding a cup of light tea, eyes gazing out, as is watching for someone. I never knew if she was waiting, or if it was just a habit of someone who once held hope. That man, tall, slender, carrying an old mailbag, would stop exactly 3 steps from the bakery. He wouldn't come in. He wouldn't say a word, just slowed down, then kept walking. I remember some of Grandma's little habits. Before pulling the pastries from the oven, she'd sprinkle a bit of sugar on top, in the shape of an 8-petal flower. Not to decorate, but to remember which batch was baked while thinking of someone. She would stir her tea 3 times counterclockwise, once clockwise, then set the spoon on an embroidered handkerchief. That cloth, never for wiping, was just to preserve the scent of jasmine from her youth. And when the kitchen clock ticked like a steady breath, she would gently lift her gaze toward the door. On windy days, the breeze slipping through the window pane made the white curtain tremble, like someone letting out a long sigh. She would hold her teacup with both hands, raise it near her face, as if searching for warmth from a distant memory. She once said, "There are people you never speak to, yet remember for a lifetime." And when I read those lines again, I understood. She had loved in the way people of her time often loved, quietly, faithfully, without asking for anything in return. Grandma started writing letters, not to send, but to keep. In a little brown notebook, she wrote line after line, as if she were speaking to herself. The bread was a little burnt that day, because I kept watching you too long. Today, you didn't look into the shop again. I felt a little foolish, waiting for your eyes. You know, once I almost ran out to give you a loaf for free, but then I got scared. There was one time, she actually wrapped a letter into the bread, just a tiny folded note. Inside, she wrote, "This loaf is for the one who slows down 3 steps today." That afternoon, she stood behind the door, her heart racing, hands trembling. The loaf sat tucked in a cloth, right by the edge of the table. The wind chimes rang softly, and his dark coat appeared, just like every evening. In that moment, her hand reached the latch. Just a little more, and the bread would be in his hands. But she froze, because inside, there was something warm and something afraid. And so, she didn't open the door. She just stood there, gripping her sleeve, watching through the curtain. When his footsteps faded away, she quietly took the loaf back inside. I think, if you knew, everything might change. But if you didn't, maybe we could just stay peaceful. Those letters never had names. No one read them, except her, and now me. Every time I read them, my throat tightens. There's something in my chest that aches, like I'm watching it happen inside that old kitchen. She tried so hard not to hope, but still, she couldn't help it. After the day she didn't open the door, he didn't write anything for 3 full weeks. 3 whole weeks. The notebook stayed untouched, the pages still blank. Only a single pressed leaf, small as a pinky fingertip, lay tucked between 2 empty pages. It had a slight crease, as if someone had hesitated to take it out, then placed it back again. No one knew what she did during those 3 weeks, but I could imagine. Mornings, she still opened the shop, still wiped the glass, still brewed the tea, 3 stirs counterclockwise, 1 clockwise. Still sprinkled sugar on the bread into 8-petal flowers, even if no one was watching. But she no longer looked up. The little chair by the window, empty. Her tea turned cold quickly, and the ticking of the kitchen clock sounded sadder than usual. On the 21st evening, she finally wrote again. Her strokes were darker. Perhaps she pressed the pen harder than usual. I don't dare write anymore, because every word I write makes me wait one more time, and I'm afraid no one will come. The next day, she tidied up the shop, more carefully than usual. Strangely, she wore her lace-collared dress, her Sunday dress she rarely used. Maybe she was preparing to leave. She gathered all the letters she had never sent, folded pages, trembling handwriting, put them into a small tin box, and placed it high on the shelf behind the jar of lychee jam. Silent feelings need limits too, and I'm about to reach mine. But then, on the afternoon she meant to close early, something quietly happened. A different postman, a younger one, knocked on the door. Not in a rush, not urgent. He said, "Someone asked me to give this to you. No name, but I think it's for you." It was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was slanted, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had gotten wet and dried in a hurry. One corner of the paper was bent, not folded cleanly, as if the writer had held it tightly for a long time. Inside was a piece of sheet music, hand-drawn in pencil, messy but careful. And a line written very small, tucked at the bottom. "The scent of your bread made me slow down by 3 steps today, Edward." She sat down, said nothing, just placed her hand on the note, her fingers trembling as they traced each line. I imagined her reading it over and over, not because she didn't understand, but because she couldn't believe it was real. About 10 minutes later, she reopened her notebook and wrote, "So, you wrote too. So it wasn't just me holding on to the unsaid. The loaf from yesterday wasn't taken, but today I'll bake again. This time, not because I hope you'll come, but because I know there was a time you once wanted to return." From that day, she kept writing. Not a lot, but different. No more lines scolding herself. No more unfinished questions. Just words like these. Today, the weather's cooler, so I made tea earlier. Not for anyone to drink, just so the kitchen could smell of ginger. I baked cinnamon bread, this scent you once slowed down for. I remember. She didn't send any of those letters, didn't add any names. But each stroke, steady, bold, slow, felt like her way of holding someone close. So close, still untouchable. Each time I reread those pages, I could almost see myself sitting in that kitchen, clock ticking, warm tea, oven light casting a soft glow on the old walls. I pictured her hand, once trembling, pausing before a sentence, then pressing forward. And I didn't understand why my throat always tightened. Maybe it's because she wrote as if she were holding someone's hand she wasn't allowed to keep. Each sentence, a gentle grip on something slipping away, lightly held, but strong enough for someone else, like me, to feel it too. I had never stepped into that kitchen, but I could picture every corner like it was my own memory. The worn tiles, the fogged-up window, a porcelain teapot with a fine crack, mended neatly with clear glue, and the scent of cinnamon bread, like a whisper from an unnamed afternoon, still lingering in the air. My grandmother, barely 30 then, sitting in oven light, fingertips brushing the edge of her notebook. Not writing, just resting there. A moment so still, so beautiful. I feared it would break if I breathed too hard. Maybe loving someone is simply setting aside a place to wait, even if there's no guarantee anyone will ever arrive. And when no one comes, we still wipe the table one more time, boil the kettle one more time, not to use it, but to hold onto a rhythm that's slowly fading, just for ourselves. I used to think love today was different, faster, louder. But reading her words, I understood. Feelings aren't measured by time or reply. They're measured by patience and the ability to keep something safe inside the heart across the years. I sat there, my hand resting on a page faded by time, and whispered without sound, "Grandma, I think I'm holding on to someone the way you once did." I don't know if she ever replied. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she just needed to know that someone once understood. As I closed the last page of that chapter, the rain still fell outside, wind brushing the window like a quiet sigh. I thought maybe my grandmother loved in a way most people today no longer have the patience for. No constant texting, no checking if the message was seen, no expectation of a reply right away. Just remembering and remembering and writing. Letters never sent, but full of feeling. I poured more tea, rested my hand on that old leather notebook, and wondered how many people are holding someone in their heart but never speak it aloud. The wind blew again, this time just a bit stronger. I startled because that sound, it reminded me exactly of how Grandma used to tell her stories, raspy, warm, and slow. I remembered her saying, sometimes someone just slowing down by 3 steps is enough to make you think of them for a lifetime. The rain didn't stop. like all the words left unspoken between two people who care for each other but can't name it. I thought, maybe not everyone needs a reply. Maybe just knowing that somewhere, someone is remembering you in the quietest, gentlest way. Maybe tonight, you too are thinking of someone like that. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. I hope somewhere in those unsent letters, you saw a part of yourself. Now, gently close your eyes. Let the rain keep falling outside. Let the unspoken thoughts settle gently in your heart, like soft echoes of memory. And if you hear the wind tonight, maybe that's the gentlest reply your heart ever wished for. Even if it has no words, even if it's just passing by. I'm Mia, wishing you the sweetest sleep. We'll meet again in another story. Good night.